Hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the folder. My husband, the man who had walked into that conference room like he was about to collect a prize, was sitting there watching his attorney read something that made all the color drain from his face. And me? I hadn't smiled like that in 2 years. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me back up because you need to understand what it actually took to get to that moment. How a woman everyone in our life had written off as broken, defeated, and too naive to fight back had been quietly, patiently holding all the cards the entire time. My name is Wren Calloway. Well, Wren Decker now. Soon to be Wren Calloway again. And until 8 months ago, I was married to a man named Brett. 11 years. 2 dogs, 1 house, and a business I helped build from a folding table in our garage into something that made real money. 11 years is a long time. Long enough to know someone completely. Long enough to be completely blindsided by them anyway. I was 22 when we met. Brett was 28, already working in residential contracting, full of that particular kind of confidence that looks exactly like competence when you're young enough not to know the difference yet. He had big plans. He talked about them constantly, building a company, becoming his own boss, leaving a legacy. I thought I was falling in love with his ambition. Looking back, I was just the first person who believed him enough to help make it real. We got married when I was 24. By 25, I had quit my job in accounting to help him get Decker built off the ground. It made sense at the time. I was good with numbers, good with systems, good with keeping 15 things organized while also somehow making sure the dogs got walked and dinner got made. Brett was the face. I was the engine. That was the deal, even if we never said it out loud. For 6 years, I did the books, managed the subcontractors, handled client billing, tracked permits and inspection schedules, and kept the cash flow from eating us alive during the slow seasons. Brett won the contracts, shook the hands, got his name on the company trucks. I got a title we never officially put anywhere, wife. Then things started to shift. Slowly, the way these things always do, he started making decisions without looping me in, started going to industry events alone, staying out later, getting defensive when I asked basic questions about money that I had every right to ask because I was the one managing the money, started pointing out things about me. Too cautious, too rigid, not fun enough, not supportive enough. In that particular tone that sounds like feedback but is actually just erosion. And then, on a Wednesday evening in October, while I was at the kitchen counter going through Q3 invoices, he sat down across from me and told me he wanted a divorce. He didn't look sad. He looked like someone announcing a business decision. He said he wanted the house, the business, the equipment, the truck fleet, the accounts. He said I could have my personal belongings and he'd give me a reasonable settlement. He actually used the word reasonable, like he was being generous, like I should be grateful. I looked at him for a long moment. 11 years of marriage. 11 years of building something together that only had his name on it. And he was sitting there like I was a vendor. He was letting go. Appreciated your service. Don't let the door hit you. What Brett didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I had found something 2 years earlier. Something buried in our company accounts that changed everything I thought I understood about our life. And from the moment I found it, I had been preparing. Before I keep going, if you're finding this story somewhere you want to stay, hit subscribe. I have more where this came from, and I read every single comment. Now let me tell you what Brett walked into. 2 years before he asked for that divorce, I was doing what I always did, reconciling the company accounts on a Sunday afternoon while he played golf. I had always been the one in the financial weeds. Brett trusted me with the numbers because Brett hated the numbers, which meant Brett had no idea what the numbers were actually doing. That Sunday, I found a transfer I didn't recognize. One transfer to an account I'd never seen, then another, then a pattern. I dug into it the way you dig into something when your hands have already gone cold and your brain is still trying to catch up to what your gut already knows. What I found took me 3 hours and left me sitting on the floor of my home office at midnight with a pile of printed statements and a very clear picture of how bad things actually were. Brett had been borrowing against everything. The house, our beautiful house that we'd refinance once to fund the business expansion, had a second mortgage I hadn't known about. He'd taken it out 14 months prior. The business had an SBA loan that was significantly larger than what he told me, plus 2 lines of credit maxed out, back taxes owed to the IRS, and equipment financing that was behind on payments. The truck fleet wasn't owned outright. It was leased, with balloon payments coming up that we were nowhere near ready for. I added it up. The debt was real. The assets were mortgaged past their value. On paper, Decker-Built looked successful. Trucks with the logo, a nice website, Brett in a collared shirt at every Chamber of Commerce mixer. In reality, we were underwater by a number that made my hands stop shaking and go completely still. And that wasn't even the worst part. When I kept pulling the thread, I found where the money had gone, a vacation I'd never taken, hotel charges in cities I'd never been to, charges at restaurants on nights. Brett had told me he was at job sites, a monthly transfer to an account I eventually traced to an apartment lease, a lease in a neighborhood 20 minutes from ours, in a name I didn't recognize but could figure out pretty quickly. My husband wasn't just failing financially, he was actively burning the money on a second life, and he had done it all through accounts that were connected to the company I'd helped build, the company I did the books for, the company he'd gotten sloppy with because he trusted me to clean up after him and trusted I would never actually look too closely. He miscalculated that part. My first instinct was to confront him, scream, throw the printouts at him, demand every answer. But I knew Brett. I'd watched him handle conflict his entire adult life. He minimized, redirected, and if backed into a corner, he turned it around and made you feel crazy for asking. If I confronted him that night, he would have had weeks, months, maybe years to cover his tracks, move assets, and make sure that when the divorce finally came, and I knew it was coming, I would have nothing. I had one thing that was completely mine, a savings account I'd been quietly contributing to since the first year of our marriage. My grandmother had told me once, very plainly, that a woman should always have access to money that nobody can touch. Not secret money, she said. Just yours. I'd listened. I had a little over $90,000 sitting in an account in my name only. Earned money, saved money, completely separate. Never commingled with the business, never used for household expenses, never mentioned. I also had an inheritance from my grandfather that had come in 3 years ago. $160,000, left specifically to me in his will, deposited into an account I'd kept entirely separate on the advice of the estate attorney. I'd never touched it. I didn't know why at the time. My grandmother's voice, maybe, still in my head. So I didn't confront Brett. Instead, I called a friend from my accounting days, a woman who had gone on to work in forensic accounting, and I had a very quiet, very careful conversation over coffee that lasted 2 hours. She helped me understand what I was looking at legally and what it would mean if I ever needed to prove it. Then I started documenting. Everything. Quietly, systematically, the way you document things when you spent 6 years keeping a contracting company out of chaos. I kept copies at my sister's apartment. I opened a safety deposit box. I saved everything encrypted on a drive that Brett didn't know existed. And then I waited. I waited through another year of marriage. I went to company events, made small talk with subcontractors, updated the scheduling software, reconciled accounts that I now knew were sinking. I was very good at pretending everything was fine. I had been, it turns out, practicing for years without realizing it. Brett filed for divorce the following October. He served me with papers at 9 in the morning while I was making coffee. He handed them over like he was returning a library book. Matter of fact, like he'd been practicing in the mirror. He'd already spoken to an attorney, a guy named Patterson who had done well enough in business litigation to seem intimidating. He'd been planning this for a while. I could see it in how polished the paperwork looked. Within a week, the dynamic in our home made it clear I was no longer considered part of it. He was cordial in the way that people are cordial when they've already decided they've won. He started having someone over. She came by twice while I was still living there. Once to drop something off, once for dinner that I declined to be present for by staying at my sister's. She was younger than me. She had that just happens to be beautiful quality that Brett had always been drawn to. She used my coffee maker. His mother made her position clear within the first week by calling me to explain gently that Brett had simply outgrown the partnership dynamic and needed someone who could keep up with where he was going. She said this with genuine sympathy in her voice, which was somehow worse than if she'd just been cruel about it. She thought she was letting me down easy. She thought this was already over. My closest friend, someone I had known since college, someone I had called the night Brett told me, someone I had cried to, started asking questions a few weeks in that felt slightly off. How was the attorney I'd hired responding to Brett's proposals? Was I planning to go after the business assets specifically? Had I talked to anyone about the house valuation? It took me a little while to put it together. Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning. She had always been a little too interested in Brett's success, always asked about the business first when we caught up, always lit up slightly when he came into a room. I don't think she planned to be disloyal. I think she just told him things without fully understanding what she was doing, because he'd made her feel like she was helping. Brett had a gift for that, making people feel like they were on the inside of something. I kept talking to her, but I became very precise about what I shared. The hardest part of all of it, harder than the financial documents, harder than his mother's phone call, harder than watching someone else exist in my kitchen, was my daughter. She was 12. She lived with both of us during the separation while we worked out the custody arrangement. She was old enough to understand that something was badly wrong, and young enough to still believe whatever the grown-up she loved most told her was true. Brett was telling her things, not cruelly but constantly, small things, how this had been coming for a long time, how I hadn't been happy either, she just couldn't see it, how he wanted everyone to move forward together. My daughter started going quiet around me, not angry, just careful, the way kids get when they're trying to figure out who to trust. And watching her look at me with that particular kind of careful, that was the thing that kept me up at night. I could walk away from the house. I could walk away from the business, but losing her trust, even temporarily, hurt in a way that nothing else came close to. The attorney I hired, a woman named Copeland who had been practicing family law in our county for 20 years and who came recommended by 3 people who had reason to know, reviewed my situation and told me plainly I had helped build a business and I was entitled to a share of its value. She said we should fight. She said she would fight with me. I said, I don't want to fight. She looked at me the way people look at someone they're worried about. She thought I had given up. She thought the shock had beaten the sense out of me. She had no idea. I asked for almost nothing in mediation: personal belongings, my car, shared physical custody, a cash settlement of $35,000. That was it. No claim to the business, no claim to the house, nothing. Brett's attorney tried not to look too pleased. Brett himself was so relieved he agreed immediately. He probably went home and told his girlfriend that night that I had simply folded, that he'd known I would, that some people just don't have the fight in them. He posted something on Instagram about new seasons and fresh starts within the week. His mother texted me that she hoped I would land on my feet. She included a prayer emoji. Meanwhile, my attorney was preparing the actual document, the one with the addendum. The settlement agreement stated clearly that I was relinquishing all claims to marital assets, the house, the business, the equipment, the trucks, but attached to that agreement was a liability disclosure. A complete accounting of every debt connected to those assets, every mortgage, every line of credit, every tax lien, every delinquent equipment payment. When Brett signed for the assets, he would be assuming sole legal responsibility for all of it. The debt was real. I had documented it myself. None of it was hidden. It was all in filings, in loan documents, in IRS records. I hadn't fabricated anything. I had simply made sure it was all accounted for, clearly, in the agreement he was about to sign. My attorney called Patterson twice in the 2 weeks before the final meeting. She offered to provide a full financial disclosure for review. Patterson raised it with Brett. Brett said no. He said he knew what the business was worth. He said he didn't need an accountant to tell him about his own company. He said this about the company whose books he had never personally reconciled, ever, in 11 years. Patterson made him sign a waiver, a document that said explicitly that Patterson had recommended an independent review and that Brett had declined against counsel's advice. Brett signed it without reading it. He was impatient. His girlfriend wanted this finished. The longer it dragged out, the more it cost. The morning of the final meeting, Brett texted me at 7:45 to say he appreciated that I'd kept things civil. 11 years of marriage, and that's the note he chose to end on. Civil. Like I'd been a reasonable business partner during a difficult Q4. I texted back that I just wanted what was best for our daughter. What was best for our daughter was the trust account, the one I'd set up with the help of a family estate attorney, funded with my inheritance and my personal savings. $250,000, irrevocable in her name. College. A first home. An emergency fund that no creditor could ever touch. My grandfather's money and my grandmother's voice working together the way they always had. The meeting was in a conference room at the mediator's office. Brett arrived with Patterson, both of them looking like they were there to close a deal. He was dressed well. He had a new watch. I noticed it because it was the kind of thing you buy when you think you've already won. I wore a grey blazer and kept my hands folded on the table. I looked tired. I was supposed to look tired. We went through the agreement, page by page, signature by signature. Brett signed everything without slowing down. Patterson was moving quickly too, until he reached the back section of the document. The addendum. I watched him read. I watched his expression change. I watched him flip back 2 pages, then forward again. Then he leaned in and said something quietly to Brett. Brett's face, that particular face I had looked at across the breakfast table for 11 years, went white. He started going through the numbers out loud, like saying them differently would change them. The second mortgage on the house, the SBA loan, the 2 lines of credit, the back taxes, the equipment financing in arrears, the truck lease obligations, the total, the actual, complete, legal total of everything he had just signed responsibility for. He looked up at me. He said, "You knew." I said, "I was the bookkeeper, Brett. I knew everything." He asked to withdraw the agreement. The mediator explained calmly and without any particular sympathy that the agreement had been signed, the process had been completed, the terms were legal. He had been represented by counsel. He had declined a financial review. He had signed a waiver acknowledging that choice. Brett turned to Patterson with an expression I will not forget. And Patterson, to his credit, said very quietly, "I told you to get the audit. You have a copy of the waiver you signed. I was doing my job." I gathered my copies of the documents, put them in my folder, and stood up. "You wanted the business and the house and everything in it," I said. "I gave you exactly what you asked for." I walked out into a Tuesday afternoon that was a kind of clear and cold that feels like it was made for exactly this moment. The collapse was faster than I expected. Within a month, Brett was fielding calls from vendors who hadn't been paid. The IRS sent a formal notice about the back taxes. The balloon payment on the truck leases came due and there was nothing available to cover it. The banker held the second mortgage sent a letter about delinquent payments. Deckerbuilt, the company with the logo on the trucks and the nice website, and Brett's name in the title, started coming apart at its actual seams. His girlfriend moved out of the house, our house, the one he'd refinanced, within 6 weeks. She posted a quote about protecting your peace and stopped following him on Instagram. She'd thought she was getting a successful business owner. She got a man standing in the middle of a financial crater of his own making, asking her if she wanted to help him figure out next steps. She did not. His mother called me 3 weeks after the agreement was finalized. Her voice had changed. She said she hadn't known how bad things were financially. She said Brett hadn't told her. She said she wanted to understand what had happened and maybe talk through some things. I told her I wished her well. I meant it, and I didn't call her back. My friend, the one who had been quietly updating Brett on my plans, called once, a week after the final meeting. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't realized what she was doing. She said she hoped we could talk. Some doors close, and you don't reach back and open them again. I had been a good friend to her for a long time. That's what I hold on to. Not the betrayal, just the part that was real before it wasn't. My daughter figured it out herself. That's the thing about kids. They notice the details before they understand the whole picture. She noticed that her dad's watch disappeared. She noticed that the house got quiet in a way it hadn't been. She noticed that his plans kept getting scaled back while his explanations for why kept getting more complicated. One evening, she came to my apartment, the one I'd rented, small and good and entirely mine, painted the exact colors I wanted, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. She looked at me for a moment with those eyes that I know are going to be looking at the world with a sharp, clear gaze for the rest of her life. She said, "Mom, did you know this was going to happen?" I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I knew I needed to make sure you were taken care of no matter what happened." She was quiet. She's 12, but she's the kind of 12 that thinks before she speaks. Then she said, "The trust account, that's why you didn't fight him." She had overheard more than I'd known. Kids always do. I said, "That's exactly why." She sat with that for a minute. Then she scooted her chair around the table and put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. That kind of wordless, certain closeness that doesn't need anything explained. 12-year-olds don't do that unless they mean it. Brett came to my apartment once, about 2 months after the final meeting. He looked like a different person, the confidence completely gone, replaced by something worn down and tired. He stood in my doorway and said he hadn't understood. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he thought maybe we could talk. He let the sentence trail off without finishing it because he couldn't quite bring himself to ask me directly for what he wanted, which was help. My help, after all of it. I said, "You got what you asked for, Brett." He stood there for a while after I closed the door. I knew because my daughter and I were on the couch watching something together, and we could hear him in the hallway. She looked at me with her eyebrows slightly raised. I shrugged. She handed me the remote. I enrolled in a business management certificate program at the community college the same month, something I had wanted to do for years and had kept putting behind everything else. I had the time now, I had the clarity. I had an apartment with good light and the exact rug I would have chosen if I'd ever been choosing anything just for myself. My first real consulting client was a woman 2 years out of a long marriage, trying to get a small cleaning business to stop hemorrhaging money and start actually working. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of the IHOP, where we met because she couldn't afford an office, and I told her to stop apologizing for that. We went through her books for 2 hours. She had good instincts and a terrible system. By the end of the meeting, she had a spreadsheet and a 6-month plan and was looking at me like maybe things were actually fixable. They were. My grandmother kept a separate account for 40 years. Not secret money, she always said, just hers, something nobody could take. I understood what she meant now in a way I didn't, when I was young enough to think I'd never need to. Money isn't about trust or distrust. It isn't a statement about the relationship you're in. It's about knowing that you exist as a person outside of every partnership you enter, that your value doesn't begin or end with what someone else decides to do with theirs. Brett had taken everything he could reach. He had signed for it all. He had the trucks with the logo, the house with the mortgage, the business with the debt, the whole beautiful-looking exterior of a life that had nothing holding it up underneath. And I had my daughter's college fund, my own name and a lease I'd signed myself, a client who needed exactly what I knew how to do, and every choice I made from here entirely my own. The morning after the final meeting, I had driven to the cemetery where my grandparents are buried. I stood there for a few minutes in the cold, didn't say anything out loud. Just stood there and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like the ground under my feet was solid. Some debts you inherit, some you sign for yourself, and some, the ones that matter, you spend years quietly making sure nobody can ever take from you. I think about the version of me who sat on the floor of that home office at midnight, surrounded by printed bank statements, hands completely still, not shaking, still. There's a particular kind of calm that comes when you finally understand the full shape of something terrible, when the picture stops being blurry and becomes, all at once, completely clear. I didn't cry that night. I just sat there and thought, okay, now I know. Now I decide what to do with it. That moment was the hinge. Everything before it, I had been living inside someone else's version of our life. Everything after it, I was building my own. Brett's choices caught up with him the way choices always do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of their own weight. The debt he'd created didn't appear out of nowhere when I signed those documents. It had been there for years, growing quietly underneath a surface that looked successful from the outside. He'd borrowed against the house, borrowed against the business, spent money on a life he was keeping hidden, and then convinced himself that confidence and momentum were the same thing as solvency. They aren't. They never are. What you build on borrowed foundation eventually lands on you, not because the universe is keeping score, but because reality is patient in a way that people in a hurry never account for. What I did in those 2 years between finding the truth and the final meeting wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me that it's understood correctly. I didn't set out to destroy Brett. I set out to make sure my daughter was protected and that I would still be standing when all of it came apart. Those are different things. The distinction lives in your reasons, not in how the ending looks from the outside. Doing the right thing, the genuinely ethical thing, often looks passive to people watching. I had access to information that could have blown Brett's world apart from the moment I found it. I chose not to use it carelessly. I chose to wait until I could use it in a way that protected my daughter's future, rather than just satisfying my anger. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of integrity I've ever practiced. What carried me through was something my grandmother demonstrated her entire life without ever naming it. She understood things clearly, she acted on what she understood, and she did not stop. Those 3 things together: the willingness to see what's real even when it's painful, the discipline to make decisions from that clarity instead of from fear, and the refusal to quit on yourself when everything gets hard. That combination is what actually determines how your life turns out. Not luck, not who loves you, not who leaves. My daughter is going to grow up watching me build something from scratch. She's going to watch me take a client's broken spreadsheet and make it workable. She's going to watch me sign my own lease, choose my own furniture, paint my own walls the exact color I want. She's going to learn, just from watching, that you don't wait for someone to hand you stability. You build it yourself, quietly, carefully, from the ground up, with your own name on it. That's what my grandmother gave me. That's what I'm giving her. The ground under my feet is solid. I made it that way.